Some promises follow a man to his grave, haunting every quiet moment until he finds the courage to make things right. For Silas Boone, that promise had been eating at his soul for 30 long years. The old mountain trapper had nothing left but $400, a worn-out rifle, and a mule named Whiskey when he bought the burned ruins of the Bellamy mansion. Everyone in town thought he'd lost his mind paying good money for charred wood and ashes. But Silas wasn't buying a house. He was buying his chance at redemption. Somewhere in those blackened ruins lay the truth about what really happened the night the mansion burned down. The truth about the woman who died trying to protect a secret that could destroy the most powerful family in the territory. What Silas found buried beneath those ashes would change everything he thought he knew about justice and revenge. But would digging up the past finally set him free? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like guilt to a conscience as Silas Boone guided his mule Whiskey down the winding dirt road towards Cedar Gulch. The old trapper's weathered hands gripped the reins with the same steady patience that had kept him alive through 40 winters in the high country. Behind him, strapped to Whiskey's pack, lay everything he owned in this world. A Henry rifle that had seen better decades, a bedroll that smelled of pine smoke and solitude, and a leather pouch containing exactly $412, every penny he'd saved from years of selling pelts to traders who cheated him more. Often than not, Cedar Gulch sprawled across the valley floor like a scar on the landscape. All ramshackle buildings and false promises. The town had grown fat on timber money and railroad dreams, but Silas remembered when it was nothing more than a trading post where honest folks could water their horses and buy supplies without getting robbed. Now it was the kind of place where a man's worth was measured by the cut of his coat and the gold in his teeth, not the calluses on his hands or the truth in his word. The Bellamy mansion, or what was left of it, sat on a hill overlooking the town like a broken crown. Even from a distance, Silas could see the blackened skeleton of what had once been the grandest house in 3 territories. Charred timbers reached toward the sky like the ribs of some great beast that had died in agony, and the morning sun cast long shadows through the empty window frames, where expensive glass had once kept out the mountain cold. 30 years ago, that mansion had been a palace of marble and mahogany, crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs. Old Jacob Bellamy had built it as a monument to his success that came from owning half the territory and controlling the other half through fear and favors. The Bellamy name opened doors from Denver to San Francisco, and Jacob's word was law in Cedar Gulch, whether the sheriff liked it or not. Silas had been a different man then, young and strong and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer the kind of power that bought judges and buried secrets. He'd been working as a ranch hand on the Bellamy spread, breaking horses and mending fences, when Sarah Bellamy had noticed him. She was Jacob's only daughter, beautiful as a mountain sunrise and twice as untouchable. She had dark hair that caught the light like spun silk and eyes the color of deep water. And when she smiled at Silas over the fence where he was training colts, he'd felt something crack open in his chest that had never quite healed. Their courtship had been conducted in stolen moments, a shared glance across the dinner table when he delivered horses to the main house, whispered conversations in the barn while her father conducted business in town. Long rides through the high meadows where no one could see them together. Sarah had dreams of changing things, of using her father's wealth to help the folks her family had stepped on to build their empire. She talked about schools for the children of ranch hands, fair wages for the men who worked the mines, returning stolen land to the tribes her grandfather had cheated. Silas had believed in those dreams because he'd believed in her. He'd even believed they might have a future together, despite the impossibility of a mountain nobody marrying into the most powerful family in the territory. Love made fools of smarter men than him. The town stirred to life around him as Whiskey's hooves clattered on the wooden planks of Main Street. Shop owners swept their stoops and hung their signs. while early customers hurried about their business with the purposeful stride of people who had learned to keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves. A few curious glances followed Silas as he rode through, but most folks had the good sense to mind their own affairs when it came to strangers with hard eyes and well-used rifles. The Cedar Gulch Bank and Trust occupied the corner of Main and Prospect, a solid brick building that projected the kind of permanent respectability that came with other people's money. Silas hitched whiskey to the rail and checked his coat pocket for the folded papers that would make his purchase official. The Byrne deed had cost him $50 just to have properly drawn up by a lawyer in Pinewood, but it was worth every penny to have his claim to the Bellamy property backed by legal documentation. The bank's interior smelled of leather and ink and the particular kind of fear that came with owing money to powerful people. Behind a mahogany counter that cost more than most folks made in a year, a thin man with nervous eyes and soft hands counted money with the reverence of a priest handling communion wine. This was Harwick, the banker who'd inherited his position from his father and his cowardice from generations of men who'd learned to bow and scrape to keep their necks unbroken. "Mr. Boone," Harwick said, his voice carrying the forced politeness of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "I have to say, I'm surprised to see you follow through with this transaction. The property is quite, well, there's not much left of it, I'm afraid." Silas placed the deed papers on the counter with the same care he'd used to set down a loaded rifle. $400 for the Bellamy property, as agreed. "Cash money?" The banker's hands trembled slightly as he examined the papers. "You understand that the property comes as is, with no guarantees about the condition of the structures or the land itself. The fire damage was extensive." "I understand plenty," Silas replied, his voice carrying the weight of mountain winters and hard choices. "The question is whether you understand that this is a legal sale, properly documented, and not subject to interference from parties who might prefer the property remain unoccupied." Harwick's Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in rough water. Of course. Though I should mention that Sheriff Morton was asking about your intentions for the property. Just routine questions, you understand. Sheriff Morton can ask me directly if he's curious." Silas counted out the bills with deliberate precision, each one representing weeks of cold mornings and dangerous work in country where a man could disappear without anyone caring enough to look for him. "This concludes our business, I believe." The deed transfer took less time than Silas had expected, though Harwick seemed reluctant to hand over the official papers that made him the legal owner of the most infamous property in Cedar Gulch. As he folded the documents and secured them in his coat pocket, Silas caught the banker stealing glances toward the street, as if expecting someone to burst through the door and put a stop to the proceedings. Outside, the morning had warmed enough to draw the scent of sage and pine down from the hills. Silas untied Whiskey and led him through the streets toward the mansion, drawing more attention with each step. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involved someone buying property that most folks considered cursed. The trail up to the mansion wound through stands of aspen and pine, following the same path Sarah used to take when she rode up to watch the sunset from her bedroom window. Silas remembered following that path himself on nights when her father was away on business, climbing through the darkness to meet her in the garden behind the house where they'd planned a future that would never come to pass. The closer he got to the ruins, the more the memories pressed against him like physical weight. He could almost hear Sarah's laughter echoing through the trees, could almost see her standing in the doorway with her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only young people possessed. She'd believed they could change the world together, believed that love and justice were stronger than money and fear. She died believing that, burned alive in her own home, while trying to protect evidence that could have brought down her father's empire. The official story was that she'd been trapped by falling timbers while trying to save the family's financial records. Silas knew better. Sarah had been murdered, killed by the same people who'd made her father rich and kept him powerful. And now, 30 years later, He was finally in a position to do something about it. The mansion ruins rose before him like a monument to failure, all blackened stone and twisted metal where once there had been beauty and wealth. The fire had taken everything combustible, leaving only the bones of what had been the most impressive house in the territory. Wild roses had grown up through cracks in the foundation, their thorns catching at Silas's boots as he walked through what had once been the grand foyer. In his coat pocket, folded next to the deed papers, was a faded tintype photograph that he'd carried for 30 years. It showed a younger version of himself, standing next to Sarah in front of the mansion when it was whole and beautiful. They were both smiling, her hand resting on his arm, and looking at it now, he could barely recognize the hopeful young man he'd been. That man had believed in justice and happy endings. This older, harder version of himself knew better. Justice was something you took for yourself, and happy endings were for people who could afford them. But redemption, that was different. That was something a man could earn through sweat and blood and the willingness to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Silas tied whiskey to a sturdy pine and began his examination of the ruins. Somewhere in this blackened skeleton lay the answers Sarah had died protecting. Somewhere in the ashes and debris was the evidence that could finally balance the scales of justice that had been tilted in the Bellamy family's favor for far too long. The wind whistled through the empty window frames, carrying the scent of old smoke and older secrets. Silas pulled his hat down against the gusts and stepped deeper into the ruins, his boots crunching on debris that had once been furniture, and dreams and lives cut short by greed and violence. He had work to do. The morning sun climbed higher as Silas methodically worked his way through the mansion's remains, his experienced eyes cataloguing every detail. Years of tracking wounded animals through dense forest had taught him to notice things others missed, the way debris had fallen, the patterns of damage that told a story beyond the obvious destruction. What he saw here spoke of violence, not accident. The fire had been hottest in the library and Sarah's bedroom, places where paper records would have been stored. That was no coincidence. Silas knelt beside what had once been an ornate writing desk, running his fingers through the ash and charcoal that had once been important documents. The destruction was too complete, too focused to be the result of a simple house fire. He spent 3 hours searching through the main floor without finding anything of significance. The professional thoroughness of the destruction told him that whoever had set this fire knew exactly what they were looking for and had taken time to ensure it was completely destroyed. But Sarah had been clever, cleverer than her killers had given her credit for. It was whiskey who led him to the discovery. The old mule had wandered away from his tie rope and was standing near what had been the back parlor, pawing at a section of the stone foundation that looked different from the rest. Silas approached and saw that whiskey was standing over a depression in the ground where the floorboards had burned away completely, revealing the stone and mortar beneath. The stones here were newer than the rest, mortared with a slightly different color of cement. Silas drew his knife and began scraping away the mortar, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever might be hidden beneath. After 20 minutes of patient work, he'd loosened enough stones to reveal a gap in the foundation, a hiding place that had been sealed shut and disguised to look like original construction. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in oiled leather and protected from moisture and fire, was a wooden box no bigger than a cigar case. Silas's hands trembled as he lifted it from its hiding place. Sarah's initials were carved into the lid. C.B. Sarah Elizabeth Bellamy. The box contained 3 items that would change everything Silas thought he knew about the night Sarah died. The first was a small brass key, tarnished with age but still solid. The second was a folded letter written in Sarah's careful handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The third was a tintype photograph showing Sarah and a man Silas didn't recognize, standing beside a grave marked with a wooden cross. Silas's hands shook as he unfolded the letter. The paper was stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, If you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass, and the truth I tried to protect has cost me everything. I pray that somehow these words will find their way to you. The only man I ever trusted with my heart, and the only one brave enough to see justice done. I have learned terrible things about my father's business dealings, crimes that go back to the founding of this territory. The wealth that built our family name was stolen from people who had no power to fight back. Native tribes cheated out of their sacred lands. Miners killed for claims that would make my father rich. Families driven from their homes by men who wore badges bought with Bellamy gold. I found the ledger, Silas, the true accounting of every theft, every murder, every act of violence that built the Bellamy fortune. It contains names and dates and amounts, evidence that could hang half the powerful men in this territory. I tried to convince father to make amends, to return what was stolen and compensate the families we destroyed. He laughed at me. Said I was a foolish girl who didn't understand how the world really worked. I know now that I was a fool, but not in the way he meant. I was foolish to think that love and blood meant more to him than money and power. When I threatened to take the ledger to the territorial governor, he showed me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. The fire you'll see when you read this, it was not an accident. They came for the ledger, and they came for me. The key in this box opens a strong box hidden beneath the floor of the old root cellar behind the house. That's where I've hidden the ledger and copies of the most damning documents. If something happens to me, I pray that someone with courage and honor will find this message and finish what I started. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after the way things ended between us. I know you have every reason to hate the Bellamy name and everything it represents. But if there is any part of you that remembers the girl who loved you truly, please don't let them win. Don't let my death be for nothing. The people father destroyed deserve justice. The families he cheated deserve to know the truth. And the men who profit from his crimes deserve to pay for what they've done. I'm leaving this world, but I'm leaving the fight to you. All my love and all my hope, Sarah. Silas read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Sarah hadn't died trying to save financial records. She died trying to save evidence of her family's crimes. She'd been murdered not by accident or misfortune, but by the same corrupt system that had made her father wealthy and powerful. The photograph showed her standing beside a fresh grave, and Silas could see now that the wooden cross bore the name Thomas Crow Feather. He remembered the name from conversations with traders, a tribal leader who'd been found, dead under suspicious circumstances about 5 years before Sarah's death. If Sarah had evidence connecting her father to that murder, the implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about old crimes and ancient grudges. If the ledger contained what Sarah claimed, it was evidence of an ongoing conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. People were still profiting from Jacob Bellamy's crimes, still using his stolen wealth to buy influence and silence opposition. Silas carefully rewrapped the letter and photograph, then slipped the brass key into his pocket. The root cellar Sarah mentioned would be behind the house, probably built into the hillside where the cold earth would keep vegetables fresh through the winter. If it had survived the fire, and if Sarah's strongbox was still there, he was so absorbed in planning his next move that he didn't hear the horsemen approaching until hoofbeats echoed off the mansion's stone walls. Silas quickly pocketed the wooden box and stood, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. Sheriff Morton rode a well-fed bay horse that probably cost more than most men made in 6 months. The badge on his vest caught the afternoon sunlight, and his gun belt was oiled leather with custom metalwork that spoke of money and vanity in equal measure. This was a man who'd bought his authority rather than earning it, and the cruel intelligence in his eyes suggested he knew exactly how to use that authority to his advantage. "Mr. Boone," Morton said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Heard you bought yourself some prime real estate. Can say I understand the attraction myself. Nothing here but ghosts and bad memories. A man's entitled to spend his money as he sees fit, Silas replied, keeping his voice level and his hands visible. "Last I checked, that wasn't a crime in this territory." Morton laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Course not. Just strikes me as curious is all. Man lives alone in the mountains for 30 years, then suddenly decides he needs a burned-out mansion in town. Makes a fellow wonder what might have changed. Maybe I got tired of the solitude. Maybe. Morton's eyes swept over the ruins, with the practiced gaze of a man who'd learned to spot trouble before it spotted him. Thing is, this property has a history. Tragic history. Folks in town prefer to let sleeping dogs lie. If you understand my meaning, I understand plenty. Silas shifted his weight slightly, ready to move if Morton decided words weren't sufficient to deliver his message. Question is whether you understand that I'm the legal owner of this property. With the deed filed at the courthouse and taxes paid in full, the sheriff's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who claimed to have grown up on the frontier. Oh, I understand the legalities just fine. What I'm wondering about is your intentions. See, some folks might get ideas about digging through the ruins, maybe looking for things that are better left buried. That kind of activity might disturb the peace, might even be dangerous for the digger. Sounds like a threat. Sheriff, sounds like friendly advice from a man who's seen what happens to folks who ask too many questions about old business. Morton gathered his reins and prepared to leave. Enjoy your new property, Mr. Boone. Just remember that some secrets are worth more than a man's life. The sheriff rode away without looking back, but his message was clear enough. Powerful people knew about Silas's purchase, and they weren't happy about it. Which meant Sarah had been right. The conspiracy that killed her was still alive, still dangerous, and still protecting the same crimes it had covered up 30 years ago. Silas waited until Morton was out of sight before retrieving the wooden box from his pocket. The brass key felt warm in his hand, and for the first time in 3 decades, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Sarah had trusted him with this burden, had believed he was the kind of man who would see justice done no matter the cost. It was time to find out if she'd been right. The root cellar lay 50 yards behind the mansion's ruins, built into the natural slope of the hill where the earth would stay cool even in the heat of summer. Unlike the house, the cellar had survived the fire intact, its stone walls and heavy wooden door blackened with soot but structurally sound. Silas approached it with the cautious reverence of a man entering a church where he wasn't certain he'd be welcome. The door was secured with a rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Sarah's brass key slipped into the mechanism smoothly, the tumblers falling into place with a soft click that seemed to echo across the years. Inside, the cellar was dark and cool, smelling of earth and preservation and secrets that had waited 3 decades to see daylight. Silas struck a match and held it high, letting his eyes adjust to the flickering shadows. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, with stone shelves lining the walls, where the Bellamy family had once stored their winter provisions. Most of the shelves were empty now, covered with dust and the accumulated debris of neglect. But in the far corner, hidden behind a row of empty canning jars, was something that didn't belong. The strongbox was made of heavy iron with brass corners about the size of a small trunk. It had been painted black once, but rust had eaten through the finish in places, leaving it mottled and ancient-looking. The lock was more sophisticated than the cellar door, a complex mechanism that spoke of serious money and serious secrets. Sarah's key fit perfectly inside the strongbox, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved as carefully as religious relics, were the documents that would change everything. The first was a leather-bound ledger with Bellamy Holdings private accounts embossed in gold letters on the cover. Below that, in smaller print, were the words, "Property of J.E. Bellamy, confidential." Silas opened the ledger with trembling hands. Page after page of entries written in Jacob Bellamy's precise handwriting, each one documenting a crime that had helped build the family fortune. Land purchases made with forged deeds, mining claims obtained through intimidation and murder, government contracts secured through bribery and blackmail. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. One entry from 1845 caught his attention. Crow Feather Tribal Lands, 15,000 acres prime timber. Chief refuses all offers. T. Morton reports hunting accident arranged. Purchase completed at sheriff's auction. $200 total cost. Esteen timber value $50,000. T. Morton, the current sheriff's father. Bought and paid for by Bellamy Gold, just like his son. The entry was followed by detailed notes about dividing the stolen land among Bellamy associates, creating a network of co-conspirators who would have strong motivation to keep the crimes secret. Another entry from 1847, Railroad. Survey dispute resolved. J. Harwick confirms route through Bellamy. Holdings after discussion of family financial difficulties. Survey team leader Thompson. Mining accident arranged per usual. New survey favors our interests entirely. J. Harwick, the banker's father, also part of the conspiracy, and per usual suggested that arranging fatal accidents was standard operating procedure for the Bellamy organization. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Honest officials who couldn't be bought were eliminated and replaced with men who could. Tribal leaders who refused to surrender their land died in convenient accidents. Miners who discovered valuable claims mysteriously disappeared, only to have their stakes registered to Bellamy associates. But it was the last section of the ledger that made Silas's blood run cold. A list of names under the heading Current Operations, Ongoing Concerns. The list included Judge Harrison, Territorial Governor Walsh, and 2 U.S. senators. These weren't historical crimes, they were current bribes. Ongoing corruption that was still active when Sarah found the ledger. Below the names was a note in different handwriting, clearly Sarah's. Father plans to expand operations into the new mining territories. Governor Walsh has promised territorial appointments in exchange for $25,000 annual payment. Current officials to be retired if they resist new arrangements. She'd been trying to stop a new wave of violence and corruption when she was killed. The fire hadn't just destroyed evidence of past crimes. It had been meant to clear the way for future ones. The strong box contained more than just the ledger. There were original deeds to stolen lands, correspondence between Jacob Bellamy and corrupt officials, and a detailed map showing the true boundaries of tribal territories before they were illegally seized. Most damning of all was a series of photographs showing prominent officials accepting money from Bellamy. Associates. One photograph showed a younger version of Sheriff Morton's father shaking hands with Jacob Bellamy while a bag of coins sat on the table between them. In the background, hanging from a tree, was the body of a man Silas recognized from tribal trading posts. Chief Thomas Crow Feather. The evidence was overwhelming, comprehensive, and absolutely damning. It was also 30 years old, which presented its own problems. Most of the original conspirators were dead, their crimes buried with them. But their children and associates were still alive, still profiting from stolen wealth, still holding positions of power that had been bought with blood money. Silas carefully repacked the documents and carried the strongbox outside. The afternoon sun seemed harsh after the cool darkness of the cellar, and he had to squint as he secured his find in Whiskey's pack. The weight of the evidence felt heavier than the iron box that contained it. As he prepared to leave, hoofbeats echoed up the trail again. This time, however, the rider was someone Silas was glad to see. May Sullivan guided her sorrel mare up the hill with the easy confidence of a woman who'd been riding longer than most men had been alive. The saloon keeper was past 60, but still handsome, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen enough of the world to judge it accurately. "Silas Boone!" she called out as she dismounted. "Heard you'd bought yourself a castle. Can't say it looks much like the pictures in those fairy tale books." "May," Silas touched his hat brim in greeting. "Didn't expect to see you up here. Figured you might need a friendly face about now." May's expression grew serious as she studied the ruins. "Word in town is that certain folks aren't happy about your real estate investment. Sheriff Morton's been asking questions about your intentions. He already paid me a visit." "Made his position clear?" May nodded grimly. Morton's been on the Bellamy payroll since the day he pinned on that badge, just like his daddy before him. Family tradition of corruption, you might say." She paused, studying Silas's face. "Question is, what do you plan to do about it?" Silas considered his options. May had run the Copper Dollar Saloon for 20 years, which meant she heard everything and forgot nothing. If anyone in town could be trusted with dangerous knowledge, it was her. And if he was going to take on the conspiracy that killed Sarah, he'd need allies. "Sarah left something behind," he said carefully. "Something that proves what really happened to her family's money and how they got it." May's eyes sharpened. "Proof that would interest certain territorial officials. I'd imagine the kind of proof that gets people killed if they're not careful with it. Then I guess you'd better be real careful." May remounted her horse and gathered the reins. "Silas, there's folks in this town who remember what the Bellamys really were and what they did to build their empire. If you're planning to balance the scales, you won't be doing it alone." She rode away without another word, but her message was clear. 30 years might have passed, but the wounds the Bellamy family had inflicted were still fresh in some people's memories. The question was whether those memories would be enough to overcome the fear that had kept the truth buried for 3 decades. Silas loaded the strongbox onto Whiskey's pack and headed down the mountain. He had a long night of reading ahead of him, and after that, some very difficult decisions to make. Silas spent the night in a grove of pines, a mile from the mansion, studying the documents by firelight while Whiskey grazed nearby. The more he read, the deeper the corruption revealed itself. Hidden among the ledger entries was a folded map that made his stomach turn. A detailed survey of tribal hunting grounds with mineral deposits, marked in red ink, and notes about acquisition strategies written in Jacob Bellamy's hand. The map showed something that changed everything. The Bellamy land grab hadn't been random greed. It had been a systematic theft of the richest mineral deposits in the territory. Every convenient accident that removed a tribal leader or honest official had been carefully planned to seize specific pieces of valuable land. The scope of the operation was staggering, but it was the notation in the map's corner that made Silas's blood run cold. Survey completed by R. Morton and J. Harwick, 1844. Government Assaya reports confirmed accurate. Proceed with Phase 2 per previous arrangements. Phase 2. The current sheriff and banker weren't just profiting from their father's crimes, they were actively continuing them. The notation was dated only 5 years ago, which meant the conspiracy was still operating, still stealing, still killing anyone who got in their way. Dawn found Silas riding toward the eastern edge of town, following a trail that led to the old tribal burial grounds. If his reading of the map was correct, those sacred lands contained the richest copper deposits in the territory, deposits that were still being illegally mined by Bellamy associates. The burial ground sat in a valley where ancient pines grew tall and straight, their branches creating a natural cathedral that had sheltered the dead for generations. But even from a distance, Silas could see that something was wrong. The earth had been disturbed, scarred with the kind of systematic digging that spoke of mining operations rather than respectful burial practices. As he drew closer, the full extent of the desecration became clear. Graves had been opened and emptied, their contents scattered to make room for mining shafts. Sacred markers had been torn down and used as building materials for a processing station that reduced copper ore to manageable chunks. The entire valley reeked of sulfur and greed. Breaks your heart, doesn't it? Silas turned to find an elderly native man sitting on a fallen log, watching the mining operation with eyes that held more sadness than anger. He was probably 70 years old, with silver hair braided down his back and hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. Despite his age, there was something in his bearing that suggested he was still dangerous when he needed to be. "John Crow Feather," the man introduced himself. "Thomas was my older brother." Silas dismounted and approached carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss. And for this," He gestured toward the desecrated burial ground. 30 years they've been digging here. 30 years of stealing our copper and scattering our ancestors like they were nothing more than rocks in the way. John's voice carried the weight of decades of helpless rage. My brother tried to stop them. He gathered evidence, talked to territorial officials, even wrote letters to Washington. They killed him for it. I know. Silas pulled out the photograph Sarah had hidden, the one showing her standing beside Thomas Crowfeather's grave. Sarah Bellamy knew, too. She was trying to help when they killed her. John studied the photograph with careful attention, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of his brother's burial marker. She came to see me before she died. Said she had proof of who killed Thomas and why. Said she was going to make it right. He looked up at Silas with sharp intelligence. You're the mountain man she talked about, the one she loved. I am. She said if anything happened to her, you'd be the one to finish what she started. Said you were the only man she trusted with the truth. John folded the photograph carefully and handed it back. Question is, are you that man? Silas considered his answer carefully. The easy thing would be to take what he'd learned and disappear back into the mountains. He could live out his remaining years in peace, knowing he'd uncovered the truth even if he'd done nothing about it. But looking at the desecrated graves and remembering Sarah's final letter, he knew that wasn't really an option. I found her evidence, he said finally. All of it. Names, dates, amounts, everything needed to bring down the whole conspiracy. John's eyes sharpened, including proof about the current operations. Sheriff Morton and Banker Harwick are still taking Bellamy money, still arranging accidents for people who ask too many questions. Silas gestured toward the mining operation. This is just the beginning. According to Sarah's notes, they're planning to expand into the new mining territories opening up west of here. More tribes to cheat, more land to steal. John stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. My people have a saying. The dead call for justice until their voices are heard. Thomas has been calling for 30 years. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hard and their hands resting on their gun belts. Silas recognized the type. Hired guns who worked for men with more money than conscience. Their leader was a thin man with pale eyes and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. You boys are trespassing on private property, the scarred man called out. Might want to move along before there's trouble. Whose property? Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Bellamy Mining Consortium. Legal claim filed and recorded. The man's smile revealed teeth stained with tobacco. This here's a legitimate mining operation, and we don't take kindly to folks who interfere with honest work. John laughed bitterly. Honest work? Is that what you call digging up my ancestors? I call it progress, old man. Territory's got to be developed, and some folks just can't see past their superstitions to understand that. The gunman's hand moved closer to his weapon. Now I'm telling you both polite-like to mount up and ride out. Next time I might not be so friendly. Silas measured the distance between himself and the 3 men. They were confident, probably experienced, and definitely armed. But they were also careless, sitting their horses like men who'd never faced serious opposition. Mountain living had taught Silas patience and precision, virtues that served him well in situations like this. We'll be going, he said calmly. But first, I'd like to know who's paying your wages. Might be important for the territorial authorities to know who's behind this operation. The scarred man's smile widened. Territorial authorities already know, friend. They're the ones who approved the mining permits. He spat into the dirt. Now get moving before my patience runs out. Silas helped John onto Whiskey's back and led the mule away from the burial ground. But as they rode toward town, he was already planning his next move. The evidence Sarah had left him was comprehensive, but it was also old. If he was going to bring down the current conspiracy, he'd need proof of ongoing crimes. And he'd need help from people brave enough to stand up to men who'd been killing with impunity for 30 years. The Copper Dollar Saloon occupied a corner building on Cedar Gulch's main street, its weathered facade hiding rooms where more honest business was conducted than in the bank or courthouse combined. May Sullivan had built her reputation on serving strong whiskey and keeping dangerous secrets, which made her establishment the closest thing to neutral ground the town possessed. Silas tied whiskey behind the saloon and helped John Crow Feather down from the mule's back. The old man moved stiffly, his encounter with the mining guards having aggravated joints that had borne too many years of hard living. But his eyes remained sharp, and his grip on Silas's arm conveyed both gratitude and determination. "Haven't been in a white man's saloon in 20 years, John said quietly. "Hope May Sullivan's hospitality extends to old Indians with long memories." "May's got her own reasons for hating the Bellamy name," Silas replied. "She'll listen to what we have to say." The saloon's interior was dimly lit and thick with tobacco smoke, but clean in the way that spoke of careful management. A dozen men occupied the tables and bar, most of them ranch hands and drifters, whose weathered faces suggested they'd seen enough of the world to mind their own business. May stood behind the bar, polishing glasses, with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to keep her hands busy while her mind worked on more important matters. She looked up as Silas and John entered, her expression neutral, but her eyes alert. "Silas, and John Crow Feather, unless I'm mistaken. Been a long time since you've graced my establishment." "Mrs. Sullivan," John nodded respectfully. "I come seeking counsel with friends of justice." May's hand stilled on the glass she was polishing. "Justice is a dangerous word in this town, John. Might want to be careful how you use it." "Dangerous times call for dangerous words," Silas said. He approached the bar and placed a $20 gold piece on the polished wood. "We need a private room and your discretion. What we have to discuss could get people killed." May studied the coin for a moment, then scooped it up and led them toward a back room she used for private poker games and delicate negotiations. The room was small but comfortable, with a heavy wooden table and chairs that had seen decades of serious conversations. More importantly, it had thick walls and a door that locked from the inside. Once they were settled, Silas spread the railroad survey maps on the table. The red marks indicating mineral deposits seemed to glow in the lamplight, and John's face grew darker as he studied the systematic theft of his people's sacred lands. "This map shows copper deposits worth millions," Silas explained. "All of them on tribal land that was acquired through fraud and murder. The Bellamy family has been systematically stealing the richest mineral claims in the territory for 40 years. May leaned over the map, her experienced eyes quickly grasping the implications. "These deposits, they're still being worked?" "Active mining operations," John confirmed. "They've turned our burial grounds into open pits, scattered our ancestors' bones like they were clearing rocks from a field." His voice carried the controlled rage of a man who'd learned to channel anger into purpose. "And the current officials are still profiting from it," Silas added. He produced the ledger and opened it to the recent entries. "Sheriff Morton, Judge Harrison, even the territorial governor, they're all on the Bellamy payroll, taking money to look the other way while the theft continues." May whistled softly as she read the financial records. "These numbers, if this is accurate, we're talking about enough corruption to bring down half the territorial government." "It's accurate." Silas's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Sarah Bellamy died protecting this evidence. She knew what it could do to the people who killed for it." The saloon keeper sat back in her chair, her face troubled. "Silas, you understand what you're proposing? These aren't just local criminals we're talking about. This conspiracy reaches all the way to Washington. Men with this much power don't go down easy." "I understand the risks." Silas folded the map carefully and returned it to his coat. "But I also understand that Sarah trusted me to see this through. And John's brother died trying to stop these same crimes. How many more people have to die before someone stands up to them?" A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. May rose and opened it to reveal a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Silas painfully of Sarah. This was Emma Harwick, The banker's daughter, and judging by her nervous expression, she had something important to say. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard—" Emma stopped as she noticed Silas and John. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." "Emma, honey, this might not be the best time," May said gently. "No. Wait." Emma stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "If this is about my father and the bank, then I need to be here. I know what he's been doing." Silas studied the young woman carefully. She was probably 25, old enough to understand the weight of what she was saying, but young enough to still believe in justice. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, but her voice was steady. "What do you know about your father's business, Miss Harwick?" he asked. "I know he's been taking money from people he shouldn't. I know he's been helping Sheriff Morton cover up crimes that go back decades." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained firm. "And I know my grandfather was part of whatever conspiracy killed Sarah Bellamy." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. If the banker's own daughter was willing to testify against her family, it could provide the contemporary witness testimony needed to make the historical evidence relevant in current legal proceedings. "Emma," May said carefully, "you understand what you're saying. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong." Emma pulled a small leather journal from her coat and placed it on the table. "This belonged to my grandfather. I found it in the bank's safe after my father gave me access to the old records. It's all here. Payments to Sheriff Morton's father, bribes to territorial officials, even instructions for arranging accidents for people who ask too many questions." Silas opened the journal and began reading. The handwriting was different from Jacob Bellamy's, but the content was sickeningly familiar. Page after page of financial transactions that documented the same conspiracy from a different perspective. The perspective of the man who'd handled the money that paid for murder. "There's more," Emma continued. "My father has been meeting with men from the territorial capital. They're planning something big, a new mining venture that will require removing several tribal settlements from valuable land. They call it the final solution to the Indian problem." John's hands clenched into fists. "When?" "Soon, within the month, according to what I overheard." Emma looked directly at Silas. "They know someone has been asking questions about the old crimes. They're planning to eliminate any potential witnesses before they expand their operations." Silas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Sarah anymore. It was about preventing a new wave of violence and theft. The conspiracy that had killed the woman he loved was preparing to kill again, and he was the only one in a position to stop them. "We need more than evidence," he said finally. "We need proof of current crimes, something that will force the territorial authorities to act even if they're compromised." May nodded slowly. "What did you have in mind?" The plan Silas proposed was dangerous, but it was also the only way to gather the proof they needed. Emma would continue working at the bank, documenting any new financial transactions related to the mining conspiracy. John would return to his people and warn them about the planned removal, while also gathering testimony from tribal elders who remembered the original land thefts. May would use her position as neutral ground to coordinate communications between the group, and Silas would do what he did best, disappear into the wilderness and watch the enemy from a place where they couldn't see him coming. 2 days later, he was lying on his belly in a stand of pines overlooking the copper mining operation, studying the guards' routines through a borrowed spyglass. The mining camp had grown since his last visit, with new equipment and more armed men patrolling the perimeter. Whatever the conspiracy was planning, they were investing serious money in security. Through the spyglass, he watched Sheriff Morton ride into camp for what appeared to be a scheduled meeting. The sheriff dismounted near a large tent that served as the operations headquarters and was immediately greeted by the scarred gunman who'd threatened Silas and John. The 2 men spoke briefly before entering the tent, where Silas could see the silhouettes of several other figures waiting inside. An hour later, Morton emerged from the tent, carrying a leather satchel that bulged with what looked like documents. The sheriff mounted his horse and rode toward town, but instead of taking the direct route, he followed a roundabout path that would bring him near Silas's observation post. Silas had two choices: retreat deeper into the forest and lose the opportunity to discover what Morton was carrying, or take the considerable risk of intercepting a lawman who was already suspicious of his activities. The memory of Sarah's letter made the decision for him. He tied Whiskey's reins to a sturdy pine and worked his way down the hillside, using the thick undergrowth to mask his movement. Morton's route would take him through a narrow canyon, where the trail was hemmed in by steep walls on both sides, the perfect place for an ambush if a man was careful about it. Silas reached the canyon floor with minutes to spare. He positioned himself behind a boulder that provided cover, while still allowing a clear view of the trail, then settled into wait with the patience that came from years of hunting prey that was smarter and more dangerous than most men gave them credit for. Morton appeared right on schedule, his horse picking its way carefully along the rocky trail. The sheriff looked confident and relaxed, like a man who'd just concluded a profitable piece of business. The leather satchel was secured to his saddle horn, and from Silas's position, he could see that it contained more than just documents. There was the distinctive bulk of gold coins mixed in with the papers. "Sheriff Morton," Silas called out, stepping into view with his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "Mind if we have a word?" Morton's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped as he calculated the odds. Silas was 20 feet away with a clear shot, while the sheriff would have to draw, aim, and fire from horseback. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't smart either, Mr. Boone. Can't say I'm surprised to find you lurking in the woods like some kind of wild animal. Morton's voice carried forced calm, but Silas could see the fear in his eyes. "What do you want?" "Information. About the mining operation you just visited and the people who pay your salary." Silas gestured toward the satchel. "Looks like you've had a profitable day." "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the copper mines that are operating on stolen tribal land. I'm talking about the bribes your father took from Jacob Bellamy and the bribes you're still taking from his associates." Silas stepped closer, keeping his rifle ready. "I'm talking about murder, Sheriff. Murder that you've been covering up for 30 years. Morton's facade of calm cracked slightly. "You're talking about old business that's better left buried. Dangerous talk from a man who's already got too many enemies. Sarah Bellamy wasn't old business when she died, trying to expose your family's crimes. Thomas Crowfeather wasn't old business when your father arranged his murder." Silas's voice carried the cold certainty of a man who'd seen the evidence with his own eyes. "And the people you're planning to kill in the new mining territories won't be old business either." The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun again, but Silas was ready for it. "I wouldn't if I were you. Dead lawmen ask inconvenient questions, and there are people in town who know where I am and what I'm doing." "What do you want?" Morton asked again, but this time the question carried the defeated tone of a man who knew he was caught. "I want you to open that satchel and show me what you're carrying. I want to know who paid you and what they're paying you for." Silas raised his rifle slightly. "And I want you to understand that your days of profiting from murder are coming to an end." Morton reluctantly unfastened the satchel and dumped its contents on the ground. Along with the expected gold coins were several documents that made Silas's blood run cold. Maps showing the locations of tribal settlements that were marked for relocation, orders from territorial officials authorizing the use of necessary force to clear the land, and most damning of all, a detailed timeline for the operation that was scheduled to begin within 2 weeks. 50 families, Silas said, reading from one of the documents. 50 families to be removed from land that your mining consortium wants to work. And if they resist? Morton's silence was answer enough. How many people are you planning to kill, Sheriff? How many children are going to die so you can get rich off stolen copper? It's not like that, Morton said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's legal. All the proper forms have been filed, all the necessary approvals obtained. legal according to laws written by men you've bought and paid for. Silas gathered up the scattered documents, keeping his rifle trained on the sheriff. Legal according to judges who take Bellamy money and territorial officials who profit from tribal land theft. The evidence in his hands was exactly what they needed. Proof of current crimes, contemporary documents that would force even corrupt officials to act. But possessing the evidence and surviving long enough to use it were two different problems entirely. What happens now? Morton asked. Now you ride back to town and pretend this conversation never happened. You tell your employers that everything is proceeding according to plan. Silas backed toward the tree line, the stolen documents secure in his coat. And you pray that when this is all over, there's still a place in the world for men who've done the things you've done. Morton gathered his reins and prepared to leave, but then turned back with something like desperation in his eyes. Boone, you don't understand what you're up against. These people, they'll kill anyone who threatens their operation, anyone. They already killed the woman I loved, Silas replied. What makes you think I'm worried about my own life? The sheriff rode away without another word, but Silas could see the defeat in his shoulders. Morton knew his days were numbered, whether he helped the conspiracy or opposed it. Men like him were useful tools, but they were also dangerous witnesses when operations went wrong. Silas climbed back up the hillside to where Whiskey waited patiently among the pines. The evidence he'd stolen would be enough to expose the current conspiracy, but it would also make him the target of every hired gun in the territory. The final confrontation was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Silas made it back to May's saloon just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Cedar Gulch's main street. The stolen documents felt like they were burning a hole through his coat, but he forced himself to move casually, like a man returning from a routine ride rather than someone who'd just intercepted evidence that could topple the territorial government. The saloon was busier than usual for a weeknight, filled with the kind of rough men who asked few questions and answered fewer. May caught his eye as he entered and nodded toward the back room where their previous meeting had taken place. Emma and John were already waiting, their faces tense with the strain of maintaining dangerous secrets. "Did you find what we needed?" Emma asked as soon as Silas closed the door behind him. Silas spread the intercepted documents across the table, watching their faces change as they absorbed the implications. The timeline for the tribal removal was aggressive. 2 weeks to clear 50 families from land that contained some of the richest copper deposits in the territory. The orders from territorial officials were explicit about the use of force, and the financial arrangements showed massive payments flowing to everyone, from local sheriffs to federal judges. "Dear God," Emma whispered, staring at a document that bore her father's signature authorizing payment to hired killers. "I knew he was involved, but this is genocide disguised as legal development." John studied the maps with the careful attention of a man who recognized every landmark and understood what they meant to his people. These settlements, they're home to families who've lived on that land for generations. Children, elders, people who've never harmed anyone. His voice carried the controlled fury of a man who'd seen too much injustice to be surprised by more. "There's something else," Silas said, pulling out the most disturbing document he'd found. "According to this, the removal operation is just the beginning. They're planning to expand into 6 more tribal territories over the next 5 years. The goal is to control every major mineral deposit west of the Mississippi." May leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a shroud. "We're not just talking about local corruption anymore. This is a systematic campaign to destroy entire communities for profit, and it's being coordinated from Washington," Emma added, pointing to correspondence from federal officials. "Some of these signatures belong to men who report directly to the president." The room fell silent as they contemplated the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Sarah Bellamy or stopping local criminals. It was about exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and involved enough money to fund small wars. We Need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it, Silas said finally. Someone outside the territorial system who isn't compromised by Bellamy money. The nearest federal marshal is in Denver, May replied. 3 days hard riding, assuming the weather holds. I'll go, John offered. My people have contacts with officials in Washington who might listen to the sound of breaking glass from the saloon's main room. Cut him off. May was on her feet instantly, moving toward the door with the quick reflexes of someone who dealt with trouble before. She cracked the door open and peered out, then quickly closed it again. We've got problems, she said quietly. Sheriff Morton just walked in with 6 men I don't recognize. Professional gunmen by the look of them. Silas moved to the room's single window and carefully peered through the curtains. Morton was indeed in the main saloon, along with men who carried themselves like hired killers. They were spreading out through the room, checking faces and asking questions in voices too low to hear clearly. They're looking for someone, he observed. Question is whether they know we're here or if they're just covering all their bases. His question was answered when Morton approached the bar and spoke directly to May's assistant, a young man named Billy, who helped serve drinks during busy evenings. Billy glanced nervously toward the back room, then nodded and pointed in their direction. Billy just sold us out, Silas said grimly. We've got maybe 30 seconds before they come through that door. The back room had only one exit, the door they'd entered through, but it also had a window that opened onto the alley behind the saloon. The window was small and high, but it was their only chance. Emma first, Silas ordered, helping the young woman climb through the opening. John followed, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. May hesitated at the window. This is my place, she said firmly. I'm not running from hired thugs in my own saloon. May, they'll kill you just for talking to us, Silas replied. Sarah trusted me to see this through, and I can't do that if the people helping me are dead. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway convinced May to reconsider. She climbed through the window just as the backroom door exploded inward, revealing Morton and 2 gunmen with their weapons drawn. Silas was already halfway through the window when the first shot rang out, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from his head. He dropped into the alley and immediately helped the others move toward the shadows where their horses waited. This way, John whispered, leading them through a maze of back alleys that he seemed to know intimately. My horse is behind the livery stable. They moved quickly but carefully, using the darkness and their knowledge of the town's layout to avoid the main streets where Morton's men would be searching. But as they reached the stable, Silas realized they had a bigger problem than just escaping Cedar Gulch. They knew exactly where to find us, he said as they mounted their horses. Someone told them about our meeting. Emma's face went pale in the moonlight. You think one of us... Not one of us, Silas interrupted, his mind working through the implications. But someone who knew about our meetings, someone who's been watching us from the beginning. The answer came to him like a punch to the gut. May's assistant Billy hadn't just pointed Morton toward their meeting. He'd been reporting their activities all along, which meant the conspiracy knew about every piece of evidence they'd gathered, every person they'd talked to, every plan they'd made. We're not just fighting the current conspiracy, Silas said as they rode out of town under cover of darkness. We're fighting people who've been watching us since the day I bought that property. They've known about Sarah's evidence from the beginning. John guided them toward a hunting trail that would take them into the mountains where they could hide and plan their next move. But as they climbed higher into the pine forests, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. It wasn't until they'd made camp in a sheltered valley that the full implications hit him. If the conspiracy had known about Sarah's evidence all along, why hadn't they tried to retrieve it before now? Why let him find the strongbox and the incriminating documents? The answer was as chilling as it was obvious. They'd let him gather the evidence because they wanted to know everyone who was involved in opposing them. They'd used him as bait to draw out potential witnesses and allies, letting him build a network of resistance so they could eliminate all their enemies at once. We walked right into a trap, he said quietly, staring into the campfire. They've been playing us from the beginning. But even as he spoke the words, Silas realized something else. If the conspiracy thought they had him trapped, they might have made a mistake of their own. They might have revealed more about their operation than they'd intended, and given him the information he needed to turn the tables. The game wasn't over yet. It was just more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The mountain camp sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by granite peaks that had weathered centuries of storms. It was the kind of place where a man could see trouble coming from miles away, which made it perfect for planning what Silas knew would be the most dangerous gamble of his life. Around the small fire, 4 people who'd never expected to become allies prepared for a confrontation that would either expose a decades-old conspiracy or get them all killed. "They're expecting us to run," Silas said, studying the stolen documents by firelight. "Morton probably has men watching every trail out of the territory, figuring we'll try to reach Denver or Santa Fe with the evidence, so we don't run," John replied, sharpening a hunting knife with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned to keep his weapons ready. "We fight." Emma looked up from the financial records she'd been reviewing. "Fight how?" "There are 4 of us against an organization that reaches all the way to Washington. They have hired killers, corrupt officials, and more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. "They have all that," May agreed. "But they also have something that makes them vulnerable. They're arrogant. 30 years of getting away with murder has made them careless." Silas nodded slowly. May was right. The conspiracy's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. They'd grown so confident in their power that they'd stopped being careful about covering their tracks. The evidence he'd intercepted from Morton was proof of that overconfidence. "There's going to be a meeting," he said, pulling out the timeline document. 3 days from now, all the key players will gather at the mining camp to finalize the tribal removal operation. Sheriff Morton, the territorial officials, the federal judges, everyone who's been taking Bellamy money will be in one place. "That's our chance," John said. "If we can document that meeting, get proof of the conspiracy in action, it's also a death trap," Emma interrupted. "And they'll have security, lookouts, probably enough firepower to fight off a small army." Silas had been thinking about that problem since they'd made camp. The mining operation was heavily guarded, situated in terrain that favored defenders, and would be even more secure during the high-level meeting. A direct assault would be suicide, and trying to infiltrate the camp would be nearly impossible. But there was another way, a way that would require everything he'd learned about tracking, hunting, and surviving in country that killed careless men without mercy. "We're not going to attack the meeting," he said finally. "We're going to let them come to us." May raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure that's going to work?" "Because they think we're desperate and on the run. They expect us to make mistakes, to take foolish risks because we're running out of options." Silas spread a hand-drawn map of the local terrain across his knees. "What they don't expect is for us to use their own arrogance against them." He outlined his plan with the careful detail of a man who'd learned that survival depended on thinking 3 moves ahead. The meeting at the mining camp would proceed as scheduled, but they would ensure that certain information reached the conspirators beforehand, information that would force them to divide their attention and resources. Emma would return to Cedar Gulch and resume her normal activities at the bank, but she would also spread carefully crafted rumors about a federal marshal who was supposedly investigating territorial corruption. The rumors would be specific enough to seem credible, but vague enough to create paranoia about how much the authorities actually knew. John would contact his tribal connections and arrange for a large gathering at the sacred burial grounds, ostensibly a ceremony to honor the ancestors, but actually a peaceful demonstration that would force the conspiracy to reveal their true intentions about using violence against native communities. May would use her network of contacts to spread word that Silas had been spotted heading toward Denver with a pack full of incriminating documents. The false trail would draw pursuit away from the mountains while making the conspirators believe their enemies were scattered and vulnerable, and Silas himself would disappear. into the high country with the real evidence, positioning himself where he could observe and document the conspiracy's response to the manufactured crisis. If his plan worked, the conspirators would be forced to reveal the full scope of their operation while believing they were eliminating the last threats to their power. "It's risky," May admitted after Silas finished explaining the details. "A lot of things could go wrong. Everything we've done has been risky," Silas replied. "The difference is that this time we're choosing the ground and setting the terms." Emma looked troubled. "What if they don't take the bait? What if they're smarter than we think and see through the deception? Then we'll have learned something important about how they operate, and we'll adjust accordingly." Silas folded the map and secured it in his coat. "But I don't think they're that smart. Smart men don't leave evidence lying around where it can be stolen. Smart men don't trust their security to people like Sheriff Morton." John stood and stretched, his joints popping in the mountain cold. "When do we start?" "Now. Every hour we wait gives them more time to consolidate their position and hunt us down." Silas kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the camp into darkness. "Emma, you'll head back to town before dawn. Tell anyone who asks that you've been visiting your sick aunt in Pinewood. May can back up that story if necessary." "What about the evidence?" Emma asked. "If something happens to you, all of this dies with you." Silas had been thinking about that problem as well. The documents were too valuable to risk losing, but they were also too dangerous to leave in any one place. The solution was to divide the evidence and hide it in multiple locations, ensuring that even if the conspiracy eliminated some of their enemies, the truth would survive. "I'm going to make copies of the most important documents and hide them in 3 different places," he said. "One set will go with John to his tribal contacts. Another will be hidden somewhere the conspiracy would never think to look. The third will stay with me. Where are you planning to hide your set?" May asked. Silas smiled grimly. "The last place they'd expect, right under their noses." The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. Emma wrote detailed instructions for accessing the bank's financial records, including the location of her grandfather's hidden journal and the combination to the safe where the most sensitive documents were stored. John prepared messages for his tribal contacts, using traditional symbols that would be meaningless to white authorities, but would convey urgent warnings to his people. May memorized the stories she would need to tell to support their deception, and helped Silas prepare a detailed written account of everything they'd discovered. If the worst happened and none of them survived the coming confrontation, at least there would be a record of the truth. As dawn approached, they prepared to separate and begin the most dangerous phase of their campaign. Each of them understood that they might not see the others again, that the plan they'd devised could easily result in all their deaths. But they also understood that doing nothing would guarantee the deaths of countless innocent people. "Sarah would be proud of what you're doing," Emma said as she prepared to ride back to Cedar Gulch. "She died believing that someone would eventually finish what she started." "She died believing in justice," Silas replied. "Let's make sure her faith wasn't misplaced." John mounted his horse and prepared to ride toward the tribal settlements that would soon be under attack. "If we succeed, the children will grow up free. If we fail, they'll grow up as slaves or not at all." May was the last to leave, her horse loaded with supplies for the dangerous days ahead. "Silas, I've seen a lot of men try to fight corruption in this territory. Most of them ended up dead or broken. What makes you think we'll be different?" Silas considered the question as he watched the first light of dawn creep across the mountain peaks. "Because we're not fighting for money or power or personal gain. We're fighting for the dead who can't speak for themselves, and the living who haven't found their voices yet. And because," he added, thinking of Sarah's final letter, "some promises are worth dying for." As his companions rode away in different directions, Silas began his own preparations for what would either be the culmination of 30 years of guilt and regret, or the final chapter in a story that had begun with love and loss in the ruins of a burned mansion. The morning mist rose from the valleys below, and somewhere in that mist, The enemies of justice were preparing for what they believed would be their final victory. They were about to learn that some mountains were harder to move than others, and that some men were harder to kill than they appeared. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the pine needles and a wind that carried the scent of snow from the high peaks. Silas lay on his belly behind a boulder formation that gave him a perfect view of the mining camp below, watching through his spyglass as the conspiracy's leadership gathered for what they believed would be their moment of triumph. The camp had been transformed overnight. Where before there had been rough tents and temporary structures, now there were comfortable pavilions and a command tent large enough to hold a dozen men in comfort. Guards patrolled the perimeter with military precision, and Silas counted at least 20 hired gunmen positioned at strategic points around the operation. The first officials had arrived at dawn, territorial. Judges and federal appointees whose presence confirmed the scope of the conspiracy. Sheriff Morton was already there, of course, along with several men Silas didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as powerful figures from outside the territory. Through his spyglass, Silas watched a familiar figure emerge from the command tent. The man was older now, his hair white and his frame slightly stooped, but Silas would have recognized Jacob Bellamy anywhere. The patriarch of the conspiracy was still alive, still pulling the strings that had been orchestrating murder and theft for 40 years. Seeing Bellamy alive and free sent a surge of rage through Silas that he had to consciously control. This was the man who'd ordered Sarah's death, who'd built an empire on stolen land and innocent blood. The man who'd bought judges and politicians like other men bought cattle, treating human lives as obstacles to be removed rather than precious things to be protected. But rage wouldn't serve him now. He needed patience, precision, and the kind of cold calculation that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous living. The evidence he carried would mean nothing if he didn't survive long enough to use it effectively. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the camp's entrance. A group of riders was arriving, not more officials or hired guns, but men in the rough clothes of working miners. Silas adjusted his spyglass and felt his blood run cold as he recognized the leader. Billy, May's assistant from the saloon, was leading a group of men who looked like they'd been recruited from the worst saloons and gambling dens in 3 territories. These weren't professional killers like the guards. Already in camp, these were the kind of desperate men who'd do anything for enough money to drink themselves to death. Silas realized with growing horror what he was seeing. The conspiracy wasn't just planning to remove tribal families from valuable land, they were planning a massacre. The hired thugs Billy had brought weren't there to provide security or intimidate resistance. They were there to ensure that no witnesses survived to contradict the official story of what happened. As he watched, Jacob Bellamy emerged from the command tent and walked toward the new arrivals. Even from a distance, Silas could see the old man's satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled killers. This was a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of violence disguised as legal process, and he was preparing to orchestrate his masterpiece. The realization changed everything. Silas had planned to document the meeting and use the evidence to expose the conspiracy through legal channels. But there wouldn't be time for legal processes if 50 families were slaughtered in the next few hours. He had to act now, even if it meant abandoning his careful plan and improvising something far more dangerous. He pulled out the set of documents he'd prepared for this moment, copies of the most damning evidence, along with a detailed account of what he'd observed. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record of the truth. He wrapped the papers in oiled cloth and hid them in a crevice between 2 boulders, marking the location so it could be found later. Then he began working his way down the mountainside toward the camp, using every skill he'd learned from 40 years of hunting and tracking. The terrain favored him, loose rocks and dense vegetation that provided cover while muffling sound. But he would have to get close enough to disrupt the operation without being detected by the guards who were specifically watching for exactly this kind of infiltration. As he moved, Silas thought about Sarah and the letter she'd written before her death. She trusted him to finish what she started, to see justice done no matter the cost. She'd believed he was the kind of man who would stand up to evil even when the odds were impossible. It was time to find out if she'd been right. Halfway down the mountainside, he heard the sound that made his blood freeze, drums echoing across the valley from the direction of the tribal burial grounds. John had kept his part of the plan, gathering his people for what they thought was a peaceful demonstration. But the conspiracy clearly intended it to be something else entirely. Jacob Bellamy had planned his final solution well. By the end of the day, there would be no tribal witnesses left alive to contradict whatever story the officials told about legal land development and unfortunate violence by savage resistors, unless one aging mountain man with a rifle and 30 years of guilt could somehow stop them. Silas reached the edge of the mining camp just as the hired killers began mounting their horses for the ride to the burial grounds. From his position behind a stack of mining equipment, he could see Jacob Bellamy addressing the assembled men with the confident authority of a general sending troops into battle. "Remember," Bellamy was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "this is a legal operation sanctioned by territorial and federal authorities. These people are illegally occupying valuable mineral deposits, and they've been given ample opportunity to relocate peacefully." Sheriff Morton stepped forward, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. "Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. We're dealing with savages who don't understand civilized negotiation." The assembled killers laughed at Morton's words, but Silas could see the nervous energy in their movements. These weren't experienced soldiers. They were desperate men who'd been promised easy money for what they'd been told would be simple intimidation. They had no idea they were about to participate in mass murder. Silas counted the odds. 23 armed men against approximately 50 tribal families that included children and elders. Even if some of John's people were warriors, they wouldn't be expecting a coordinated attack disguised as legal enforcement. The massacre would be swift and one-sided unless someone disrupted the operation before it could begin. Silas had 3 shots in his rifle and 6 in his revolver. Not nearly enough to stop 23 killers, but maybe enough to create enough chaos and confusion to delay the attack until help could arrive. The problem was that help would have to come from territorial authorities who were either corrupt or compromised, and even honest officials would be reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be a legal operation. He needed something more than gunfire. He needed to expose the conspiracy in a way that would force even corrupt officials to distance themselves from it. As the killers prepared to ride out, Silas noticed something that gave him an idea. The command tent was still occupied. He could see shadows moving inside as the officials discussed their strategy for explaining the coming violence. If he could capture or kill the leadership while their hired guns were away, the entire operation would collapse. But first, he had to warn John's people. Silas worked his way around the perimeter of the camp until he reached the equipment shed where the mining operation stored its blasting powder. The building was unguarded. All the security was focused on protecting the officials and watching for external threats. Breaking into the shed was simple for a man who'd spent decades surviving by his wits. Inside, he found exactly what he needed. Enough dynamite to level the command tent, along with fuses and the tools needed to set a controlled explosion. But more importantly, he found something that would serve as a warning signal visible for miles. Emergency. Flares that the mining operation used to signal for help in case of accident. Silas selected 3 flares and carried them to high ground overlooking the burial valley. John would recognize the signal. They'd agreed that 3 flares meant immediate danger and the need to evacuate. It would cost Silas the element of surprise, but it might save 50 lives. He struck the first flare, just as the riders emerged from the mining camp, heading toward the tribal gathering. The brilliant red light arced across the sky like a falling star, followed quickly by the second and third flares. In the distance, he could see the tribal gathering, and more importantly, he could see movement as people began responding to his warning. The flares had the effect he'd hoped for, but not just on John's people. The riders saw them too, and their leader, Billy, the treacherous saloon assistant, pulled up his horse and began issuing new orders. Some of the riders spurred their horses toward the burial grounds, trying to reach the tribal gathering before it could disperse. Others turned back toward the mining camp, realizing that their operation had been compromised. Silas used the confusion to sprint back toward the command tent, carrying his improvised explosives and hoping he could reach the leadership before they realized what was happening. The guards around the tent were looking toward the flares and the scattering riders, giving him precious seconds to get close. He was 20 yards from the tent when Jacob Bellamy emerged. His face twisted with rage as he realized his carefully planned operation was falling apart. The old man's eyes locked onto Silas, and for a moment 30 years collapsed into nothing. They were the same two men who'd faced each other the night Sarah died. The powerful patriarch protecting his criminal empire, and the young ranch hand who'd loved his daughter. "You," Bellamy said, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and hatred. "I should have killed you 30 years ago." "You tried," Silas replied, raising his rifle. "But some promises are harder to break than you thought." The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the burial grounds, followed by the sharper crack of military rifles. The massacre had begun, despite his warning. John's people were fighting for their lives, while the conspiracy's leadership remained safe in their mountain stronghold. Silas had one chance to end this, one opportunity to balance the scales that had been tilted toward injustice for 4 decades. It was time to keep the promise he'd made to a dying woman in a burning house. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, Silas saw everything that had led to this confrontation reflected in Jacob Bellamy's eyes. 30 years of unopposed power, of buying and killing his way to wealth, of believing that money could purchase immunity from justice. The old man reached for the pistol at his belt with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Silas shot him before. The gun cleared leather. The crack of the rifle echoed across the mining camp like thunder, and Jacob Bellamy crumpled to the ground with a look of surprise that would follow him into whatever judgment awaited men who'd built empires on innocent blood. The patriarch of the conspiracy was dead, but his killing was only the beginning of what needed to happen. The remaining officials burst from the command tent in panic, some reaching for weapons, while others simply ran for their horses. Silas recognized Judge Harrison and 2 territorial appointees whose signatures appeared on the documents authorizing the tribal massacre. These were men who'd sold their honor for Bellamy gold, and they were about to discover that some transactions couldn't be reversed. Sheriff Morton appeared around the side of the tent, his gun already drawn and his face twisted with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "You've destroyed everything," he screamed, firing wildly at Silas's position. 40 years of progress, gone because of one bitter old fool who couldn't let the past stay buried. Silas rolled behind a mining cart as Morton's bullets sparked off metal and stone. The sheriff was a fair shot, but he was also panicked and angry, never a good combination for accurate gun work. Silas waited for the inevitable pause as Morton reloaded, then stepped out and put a bullet through the corrupt lawman's chest. Morton fell backward, his badge catching the sunlight one last time before being stained with the blood of the people he'd betrayed. As he died, Silas felt a grim satisfaction that Sarah's murderer had finally faced justice. But the gunfire from the burial grounds was growing more intense, and Silas knew he was running out of time. He lit the fuse on his improvised explosive and threw it into the command tent, where the remaining officials were trying to organize their escape. The blast shattered the morning quiet and sent a pillar of smoke rising into the clear mountain air. When the smoke cleared, the conspiracy's leadership was scattered and broken. Some were dead, others wounded, and the survivors were fleeing in whatever direction offered the quickest escape. But more importantly, the coordinated attack on John's people had collapsed into chaos as the hired killers realized their employers were dead or dying. Silas mounted whiskey and rode hard toward the burial grounds, hoping he wasn't too late to prevent the worst of the bloodshed. As he crested the ridge overlooking the sacred valley, he saw that John's warning flares had saved more lives than he'd dared hope. Most of the tribal families had escaped into the forest, leaving only a small group of warriors to hold off the attacking killers. The hired guns were discovering that fighting experienced warriors on their own territory was very different from murdering helpless families. John Crowfeather stood behind the broken remains of his brother's grave marker, a Winchester rifle in his hands and the calm expression of a man who'd found his purpose. Around him, a dozen tribal fighters used the terrain to their advantage, picking off attackers with the patience of hunters who understood that survival meant making every shot count. Billy, the treacherous saloon assistant who'd led the attack, lay dead near the edge of the burial ground, with an arrow through his chest. His surviving followers were already retreating, realizing that their easy payday had turned into a death trap. As Silas approached, John lowered his rifle and nodded toward the smoke rising from the mining camp. "I heard the explosion. I take it you found what you were looking for. Jacob Bellamy is dead. Zoar Morton and most of the officials who were taking his money." Silas dismounted and surveyed the aftermath of the battle. "What about your people?" "Safe, mostly. 3 wounded, none killed. Your warning gave us time to get the families away before the attack began." John's expression grew grim. "But this isn't over. There are more men like Bellamy, more officials who profit from our suffering. Maybe, but they'll think twice before trying something like this again." Silas pulled out the packet of documents he'd prepared. "These contain everything: names, dates, financial records, correspondence. Enough evidence to expose every official who took Bellamy money and every crime they helped cover up." John accepted the documents with careful reverence. "What happens now?" "Now you take these to your contacts in Washington. Make sure they reach people who can't be bought or intimidated." Silas looked toward the mining camp where the smoke was beginning to clear. "And I finish what Sarah started." It took 3 days to gather all the evidence and prepare a complete record of the conspiracy's crimes. Emma returned from Cedar Gulch with additional financial documents from the bank's hidden records. May provided testimony about the conspiracy's operations in town and the officials who'd participated in covering up their crimes. Together, they compiled a dossier that documented 40 years of systematic theft, murder, and corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, comprehensive, and impossible to dismiss or cover up. When it reached honest officials in Washington, it would trigger investigations that would reach the highest levels of territorial government. 2 weeks later, Silas stood in the ruins of the Bellamy mansion, watching federal marshals load the last of the evidence into wagons bound for the territorial capital. Judge Harrison was already in custody, along with 3 other officials whose names appeared in Jacob Bellamy's ledger. The investigation was expanding daily, as each arrest led to new revelations about the scope of the conspiracy. May approached as the marshals prepared to leave. "Sarah would be proud," she said quietly. "You kept your promise." Silas nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "I kept one promise, but there's another one I haven't fulfilled yet." He pulled out the faded tintype photograph that had started his quest, the image of himself and Sarah standing before the mansion when it was whole and beautiful. For 30 years, he'd carried the guilt of her death and the weight of his failure to protect her. But now, standing in the ruins of the empire she died trying to expose, he finally understood what she would have wanted from him. She didn't just want justice for the past, he said. She wanted to prevent future crimes, and that work isn't finished. As the wagons disappeared down the mountain trail, Silas began planning his next move. There were other territories, other conspiracies, other innocent people who needed someone to stand up for them. He was older now, more experienced, and he understood better than ever that justice was something you had to fight for every single day. Some promises, he'd learned, lasted longer than the people who made them, and some fights were worth continuing even when the original enemy was dead and buried. The ashes had finally told their story. Now it was time to make sure it was never forgotten.